Palestinian writer called Finkelstein, who's a student of Gandhian nonviolence. And he says that because the International Court of Justice have ruled that the separation wall is against international law, if 100 Palestinians were to advance on the wall with a pickaxe in one hand and the ICJ ruling in the other hand, the chances are the Israelis would shoot them. And that would begin to attract public attention. If another 100 then step forward, ICJ ruling in one hand, pickaxe in another hand, the chances are the Israelis would shoot them. By which time Israeli public opinion and Jewish opinion around the world would be so appalled at what the nation of Israel is doing that they would have to change. And Finkelstein makes the point that there are 200 Palestinians who are willing to give up their lives for the sake of their own liberation. So why not do it non-violently? Because there is power in that. And when I told that story to somebody, I think over dinner, they said, but by the time the second 100 came along, the Israelis would do something else. Which is true. So the importance of creative inventiveness in these creative acts of resistance. But the point is that we don't have to wait for the revolution. We can do these things now, and it is the power of small stories and small acts to change the status quo. Do not underestimate the power of small things. I've got a mate who I work with, and I was talking to him about doing this, and he left a jar of jam on my desk with a little sign underneath it saying, "Talk to me about stories and power." I kind of went, "Ed, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, that little jar of jam tells the story. I made that jam last Saturday," he said, "from the raspberries I grow on my allotment. And I always put it into small jars so that I can distribute it far and wide." I said, "Well, what's that got to do then?" He said, "It's a different kind of economics." And he distributes that down his street, for example, so that people don't believe the lie that they have to go to the supermarket to buy jam. They could actually grow some food and share it. It's only a little story, and my mate is probably mad enough to think that that will change the world, but who knows? Anyway, I couldn't bring the jam because I only brought hand luggage and they would have taken it off me, so I've got it at home to eat. The importance of Gandhian nonviolence is this: that Gandhi, for him, the highest value wasn't nonviolence, it was courage. And he said, do not hide your lack of courage behind your nonviolence. Gandhi said, I would prefer you to be violent and courageous than lacking in courage and nonviolent. But he said, if you can choose courage and nonviolence, that is a higher calling. And it takes courage to do these things. It takes courage to stand up to power. Does nonviolence work? Conversations, again, during the last 24 hours have been, well, you know, is God really at work? Does this stuff really work? Are we changing anything? In 1989 alone, 13 nations, 1.7 billion people, 32% of the world's populations experienced nonviolent revolution. Towards the end of what has been the most violent revolution, most violent century in human history, by far. And that was without organisation, without social movement, without training. In the Philippines, they did train. They trained, I think, 500,000 people to go and monitor the elections. Just a simple non-violent act that caused the overthrow of Marcos. Wink and a guy called Jean Stolvich, who started Christian Peacemakers, who was in the American Army, and started to think, we've got soldiers by their tens of thousands willing to lay down their lives for the domination system. What about people willing to lay down their lives for non-violence, for non-violent revolution? What about if we began to train one another in these acts, in these ways of being? then we could make this the non-violent century, as opposed to the last century being the most violent century. So, just find my place here. Skip through some stuff there. Non-violence. There's another really nice non-violence story. Wink says that non-violence invites a miracle. And there's somebody I know, a guy called Alistair McIntosh, who wrote an amazing book called Soil and Soul about land, about how tenants in Scotland got their land back from landlords. And it's the most phenomenal book. But I heard him tell this story. And he advocates non-violence. And he was in a situation once in Glasgow, which is a very violent city. And I think he intervened in a situation that was really beginning to look very violent between a man and a woman on the street. And he said he's not a courageous man. He wears 2 hearing aids. He's about my age. He's not strong. And he said it took him all his courage to step into that situation that could become violent. And he was shaking and quivering. And then he said, as I stepped into the middle, and this guy doesn't come from a Christian worldview at all. He said, as I stepped into the middle, I was suddenly filled with an extreme peace and love for both of these people that I stepped into the middle of. And the man, who was a huge guy with big tattoos and, the guy who looked like he used a lot of violence, suddenly was unable to move. Literally. Could not move, could not speak. And Alistair, he tells another story where that didn't happen. A similar story. So it's not like he becomes Superman and that always happens to him. But the point he made was that if we will position ourselves in those places, that we invite a miracle. Something may just happen, which takes away the logic of power. On the wall, which we were looking at pictures of last night, just outside Bethlehem, there's an amazing bit of graffiti. And it's this. This, referring to the wall, is not this is the logic of power. It is not the power of logic. There is a logic of power. It works, apparently. But actually it really doesn't. There is another logic, another way of looking at that. And that is what we need to be constantly seeking out as we engage with the power, not necessarily looking for power in order to confront power on its own terms, but looking at creative ways, in the ways that you guys do with your oil drums over there and going in the streets with them and dressing up as shaking shapes and all those kind of things. You do it, but let's do so much more of it. And let's, just as Jesus was so targeted, let's target it. I was saying to some guys today, I've got some friends in Leeds who are lesbian feminists, and they came into our office the other day and they said, let's go to France dressed in burqas and see what happens. And then I had a mate in there who's a Salvation Army minister, and he said, I actually know a load of ministers on the south coast of Britain who are ready to do that, to dress up in burqas and all go to France, just to stand in solidarity with Muslims. And whatever you think about the burqa, to stand in solidarity and expose the cultural violence that is underneath some of that thinking. So it might be a nice little creative act, so you might see us on the news when you see some apparently Muslim women speaking in very deep voices, with their beards poking through the gauze on the burqa. The other thing, of course, the profound thing that Jesus talked about is loving our enemies. And our enemies become a gift to us because they enable us to see in ourselves things we would not see unless our enemy was there in front of us and we were dealing with the enemy, but I won't deal with that. what I do want to finish with is prayer and the powers. And Wink is amazing on this. Albert Camus said this: violence and hatred dry up the heart itself. The long fight for justice exhausts the love that gave birth to it. The reason I love organisations like this and organisations like Speak, and why most of my friends in Leeds are young, is because they're not exhausted. They're not dried up. And an awful lot of people of my generation are, because they've become weary. And how can we not dry up and become weary and exhaust the love that gave birth to our passion in the first place? Basically, I'm just reading some of Wink's words because they're absolutely amazing. The struggle to be human in the face of superhuman and dehumanizing powers requires prayer. It's the most fundamental engagement with the powers where their secret spell is broken. It's the interior battlefield where the decisive victory is won before any engagement in the world is even possible. My words, prayer opens up a space, a possibility for us not to be under the spell of the domination system. In Jesus' temptations, he binds the strong man. He binds the domination system that tries to subdue him and co-opt him